The studio lights were bright, almost theatrical, washing the set in a polished glow that made every smile look practiced and every pause feel longer than it should. Joe Rogan sat across from the panel with an easy posture, hands resting loosely, eyes attentive. He didn't fidget. He didn't scan the room. He looked directly at whoever was speaking, listening in a way that felt increasingly rare on live television. The hosts welcomed him with quick pleasantries, the kind that sounded friendly but carried an edge of anticipation, as if everyone knew the conversation would not stay light for long. The first question came wrapped in humor, but the punchline pointed straight at him. Joe smiled, letting it pass. The second question followed immediately, sharper, framed around headlines and short clips that had circulated online for weeks. He nodded again, still silent. A third voice jumped in before he could answer, adding context that felt less like clarification and more like a conclusion already drawn. The audience laughed nervously. Joe waited. When he finally spoke, he didn't push back hard. Not yet. He thanked them for having him on, acknowledged that conversations today often get messy, and said he understood why people had strong reactions to long-form discussions taken out of context. It was calm, almost disarming. For a moment, the tension softened. But then the interruptions resumed. One host cut in mid-sentence, another reframed his words before he could finish. Joe stopped talking and leaned back slightly, eyebrows raised, letting the moment breathe. That silence did more than any argument could have. The chatter slowed. Someone joked to fill the gap. Joe chuckled, then leaned forward again, voice steady. He explained how long conversations work, how nuance gets lost when clips are trimmed to 10 seconds, how curiosity isn't the same as endorsement, how asking questions shouldn't be treated like making declarations. He didn't accuse. He described. And with every example, the room grew quieter. A host challenged him directly, suggesting that platforms have responsibilities and that giving space to controversial ideas could cause harm. Joe nodded, agreeing that responsibility matters. Then he asked a simple question. Who decides which ideas are too dangerous to hear? The panel hesitated. One answered with generalities. Another tried to pivot to a different topic. Joe gently brought it back, saying that avoiding the question was part of the problem. The audience murmured again, this time with interest rather than discomfort. As the discussion continued, Joe began to unpack the difference between debate and declaration. He talked about growing up in gyms and comedy clubs, places where people argued loudly, disagreed fiercely, and still shook hands afterward. He described how those environments taught him to test ideas, not protect them. His tone never rose. He even joked about how wrong he'd been plenty of times, drawing laughter that felt genuine. The humor wasn't cutting. It was self-aware. One host attempted to corner him with a quote attributed to him online. Joe asked where it came from. She cited a clip. He smiled and said he remembered the conversation, then explained what came before and after that exact sentence. The context changed everything. The audience reacted audibly, a low wave of "oh" rippling through the seats. Joe wasn't gloating. He simply shrugged, as if to say this happens all the time. The panel tried a new angle, suggesting that his audience was uniquely influential and that words spoken casually could be taken seriously by millions. Joe agreed again, saying influence should encourage more honesty, not less. He talked about trusting listeners to think for themselves, about respecting people enough to let them hear ideas and decide what made sense. He asked why trust in the public seemed to vanish the moment opinions diverged from the accepted script. At one point, the conversation nearly spiraled into crosstalk. Joe raised his hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to signal patience. He waited until the noise died down. When he spoke, he thanked them for the passion, then calmly pointed out that the format itself made real discussion difficult. Short segments, constant interruptions, the pressure to perform for applause, none of it helped understanding. The irony hung in the air, thick and unavoidable. The audience leaned forward now. Even the host seemed more cautious, choosing words carefully. Joe continued, describing his podcast as an experiment rather than a pulpit, a place where he explored ideas out loud and let listeners follow the process. He admitted uncertainty. He admitted mistakes. And by doing so, he removed the sharp edges the panel seemed ready to fight against. A producer signaled from off-camera that time was running short. The hosts tried to wrap things up with a final question, one last attempt to frame the conversation on their terms. Joe answered simply, saying that conversations shouldn't be about winning or humiliating anyone, but about understanding why people think the way they do. The word humiliating wasn't spoken, yet it lingered in the contrast between how the exchange had begun and where it had landed. As the segment ended, the applause came, Not explosive, not forced, but steady. Joe smiled, thanked the panel again, and leaned back in his chair as the cameras pulled away. Part 1 of the encounter closed not with a shouting match or a viral meltdown, but with something far more unsettling for a show built on control. A guest who refused to play the expected role, and in doing so, quietly shifted the balance of the room. When the cameras cut to commercial, the energy in the studio didn't disappear. It changed shape. The hosts adjusted their notes, exchanging quick glances that said more than words could. Joe remained seated, relaxed, sipping water, chatting lightly with a stagehand who had wandered a bit too close, clearly curious. There was no victory lap, no smug grin. Just a sense that something unexpected had happened, and everyone in the room felt it. Back from the break, the tone shifted. The opening banter was warmer, almost careful. One host thanked Joe for staying composed, joking about how live TV had a way of heating things up. Joe laughed and replied that he enjoyed real conversations, even uncomfortable ones. The audience chuckled, and the tension eased, but not completely. The undercurrent was still there, humming. The panel tried to regain footing by steering the discussion toward culture at large, comedy, media, the speed of outrage. Joe leaned into it, sharing stories about comedians workshopping jokes in front of unforgiving crowds, about learning quickly what landed and what didn't. He explained how failure in public builds resilience, how disagreement sharpens ideas rather than destroying them. The point wasn't defensive, it was reflective. A host pushed back, arguing that television had a responsibility to protect viewers from misinformation. Joe nodded, acknowledging the concern, then drew a line between protecting and policing. He asked whether shielding people from ideas implied a lack of confidence in their ability to reason. The question wasn't aggressive, but it lingered. The audience murmured again, this time louder. As the discussion deepened, Joe began asking the panel about their own experiences with backlash. One admitted that segments were often clipped and shared without context. Another said nuance didn't travel well online. Joe smiled, gently connecting their experiences to his earlier point. There was a brief pause where no one interrupted him. It felt earned. The show attempted to pivot once more, introducing a graphic on the screen, headlines, trending tags, simplified summaries. Joe glanced at it and laughed softly, saying that complexity rarely survived bullet points. He didn't dismiss the concerns outright. Instead, he unpacked how narratives form, how repetition hardens opinions, and how curiosity